There we go. All right, good morning. So I want to talk to you this morning about entrepreneurship and prosperity creation. It's something that economists have talked about for some 300 years, perhaps, trying to figure out how do we actually become rich, how do we create this value and this prosperity, this higher well-being, our standard of living, where does it come from? The core of it is entrepreneurship, which of course I have to say is an entrepreneurship professor. But I'm going to show you a little bit where does prosperity come from and how do we create it? What are the causes? What are the processes? So first, just very briefly about myself. I'm associate professor of entrepreneurship. I'm a senior fellow of the Mises Institute, and I'm also on the board for Liberty International. So if you happen to be in Texas in a couple of weeks, we have a world conference in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I'm also an author. I've published a number of books that, of course, you're free to buy. So let's start with, at the very core, prosperity is about value. But what is value? We have very different views of what value might be. We think of different things. We might think in terms of money, but that's not really the core of it. Rather, when economists talk about value, we talk about satisfaction. We talk about satisfying wants that we have. We talk about satisfaction from our own perspective. So what is the well-being that we perceive? How do we become better off in whatever personal terms? And how do we improve our situation? And in fact, everything that we do is intended to improve the situation that we're in. So make it better than it was, or make it better than we otherwise expect that it would be. And when we do this personally, we of course enrich ourselves, but when we do it as a society or as a community, we enrich everybody in society and in the community. Value is always in the eye of the beholder. And this is a problem that entrepreneurs struggle with, because you can create something that is for yourself, but whether it's of value is something that the customer will ultimately decide and determine. And this is something we've known from the very beginning of Austrian economics. Carl Menger, the founder, talked about value in his very first book that founded the School of Economics. And he said that value is nothing inherent in goods. It's not the things themselves. It's not a property in the thing, nor an independent thing existing by itself. And he says it's a judgment. It's a matter of what we think of something, and we use goods and we use services in order to satisfy something for ourselves. So value, he said, does not exist outside of the consciousness of men. It's all in our minds. So the question then is it all just a sham? Where does value come from? How is value created? Well, it's created because the world is scarce and we can find different ways of using the world to satisfy our wants. To create change in the world so that we can use it better and so that it fits better with our own needs and society's needs overall. So we can become more effective in satisfying the wants. And there are really two ways in which we can create value. The first one is to improve the distribution of goods. We all know of trade, of course, in this room. And exchange is one of those ways where both parties gain, because we want what we get more than what we give up. And voluntary trade, therefore, in every instance, every transaction makes the transactors, the parties of the exchange, better off. And it's also why involuntary exchange that we would not go through with other than with force, that makes us worse off. So any trade that we see is really an improvement, a betterment of the distribution of goods. The other, of course, is increasing and improving the usefulness of the world in general by creating goods and creating services. And this is ultimately driven by and caused by entrepreneurship. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and especially how it creates prosperity. So, what causes prosperity? And that's actually the right question to ask. And I have a tweet from many years ago that I've been hated for by thousands and thousands of people, in which I used a common question: Where does poverty come from? What causes poverty? And it's nothing really, because poverty is what we have if we do not do anything at all. The real question is, where did prosperity come from? How did we become rich? Where did this well-being come from? How come we can be today about 8 billion people and lead better lives than just a fraction of the world population could before with the same resources? That is the proper question. Of course, the answer is entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is, to put it in very simple terms, what creates new value. So it tries to figure out how to better satisfy people on their own terms. And there's a quote that I like to use here from Henry Ford, which he might or might not have actually uttered. But he supposedly said that if I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So you can't really ask people what they want because they don't really know. And Steve Jobs has a similar statement where he said you cannot design products using focus groups, because people know what they know, but they can't imagine how they could be satisfied to a better extent. So I think this is important to understand what entrepreneurship does in the economy, because entrepreneurs imagine new ways of satisfying people, and they make it happen, even if people don't believe in them. Another way to create value is production, by simply changing things up, new combinations of things, and producing goods and services, not using the world as it is presented to us, but instead changing it in some way. It's not about creating new value, but it's about creating more useful tools in the world. And then, of course, trade to effect a better distribution of those things that can help satisfy our values. So those are really the three core parts of creating prosperity in the world: entrepreneurship, production, and trade. And how do you illustrate this? Well, I mean, in this day and age, of course, I used an AI engine. So I asked the AI to create an image that combines these three, to show it to everybody so we can all understand it, and this is what it came up with. I'm not sure exactly how that illustrates those three things, but that's AI for you. I also don't know why there are plenty of American flags, or why he's dressed like he's 100 years old. But that's what AI gives you. Okay, so how do we create prosperity, though? That is the real question. And really, how can we make sure that there is enough of this entrepreneurship and production and trade, and especially in that order? How can we make sure that there are entrepreneurs who are imaginative enough, who create these new things that will become of value to us, that we can't really ourselves as consumers foresee or predict? That means that the question of how to create prosperity and how to increase our standard of living is really a question of how do we create entrepreneurship, whatever that means. And of course, the question is also, can we create it? Can we design it? Can we make it happen? The problem here is, of course, that entrepreneurship, just like the faster horses, is an uncertain undertaking. We cannot know if something is going to be successful because we only know when we present the goods to customers whether they will find it useful or not, whether they can understand it, and whether they find a use for it, they can satisfy their wants or not. And since it is uncertain, we can't really plan it. We can't really put together a blueprint and figure out exactly how to do this. So entrepreneurship is about figuring out what should be undertaken, not the faster horses, but maybe an automobile. How should it be undertaken? How do you produce it? How do you create it? And when should you do it? And who should do it? Those are the questions that we need to answer. And we can really only know this after the fact, because it's only after you have done this, after someone has decided what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and that they are the person to do it, only after that fact can we figure out that, oh, this was actual value, or, as in many cases, this was not of value at all. Okay, so this just means that a central plan is simply impossible. You can't do it. So it has to be a decentralized process. You have to allow entrepreneurs to try all these different things that they think and they're willing to bet on will create a better world. Okay, so What does that mean for us if we want to create more entrepreneurship? Well, the problem is that we can't really improve it. We can't really perfect entrepreneurship itself. It has to be, what, as Mises put it, a division of intellectual labor, in the sense that you have to have entrepreneurs imagining things and competing with each other on those imaginations, those imagined goods and services. It's a process that works best if the entrepreneur, him or herself, gains the value, gets the reward from being successful, but also suffers the personal losses if not successful, so that the resources can change hands to the better hands, but also that there's enough motivation to trigger someone who wants to undertake this. In order to maximize entrepreneurship, we have to know the outcome of it. We have to know whether it is actually valuable, which of course we cannot, since it's not decided until after the fact. So, considering this, does that mean that there's nothing we can do at all? Should we just resign and let it be? Maybe get some of the politicians out of the way, but other than that, nothing at all? Not necessarily. What we can do, and what we have done throughout history in particularly the West, is to create a framework of rules that are unchanging, that are general, and that are not very intrusive. And this means, of course, that it does not give anyone the power to steer the economy or the power to direct economic actions, but instead allow people to be entrepreneurs if and when they choose to. We can create institutions that are supportive of entrepreneurship. This could mean both cultural values and in terms of laws or rules, such as private property is of course very important, because how can you get the rewards from what you do or suffer the losses if you don't own what you actually invest in this? And of course, we have to allow people to trade. So without these exchanges between people, there can be no better distribution of those goods. And how do we then deal with this, and how do we limit what can be done and what should not be done? Well, maybe we should not. Maybe it is the case that we should allow people to exchange as freely as possible so that they can figure out where things do most good. And I'm sure you're aware of my late friend Spencer McCallum's book, which designs a society. And he talks about these ideas, of course. There's a backside of this, because when you produce these rules that are predictable and foreseeable so that you can facilitate entrepreneurship, that means you also get the tools for regulating and restricting. And of course, these rules are restrictive. Private property is restrictive in the sense that what is mine and not yours. So I want to talk a little bit about regulations and what they mean and what type of effect they have. And I think the clue to creating prosperity and understanding where it comes from is the understanding of regulations themselves. So first of all, we have to recognize that a regulation is a restriction. It's an imposed limitation on what can be done and who can do it and when can it be done and so forth. It is by narrowing the scope of what people are allowed to do, that's what regulations tend to do. And that's what they are intended to do as well. They push and steer action in one direction rather than the other. Of course, taxes are another such restriction. They're a financial burden, but especially on the end result, on the profit earned. Regulations tend to restrict the actions taken, and taxes tend to be on the profits themselves. So what then is the real cost of regulations? And economists have talked about this for quite a long time and studied this and analyzed this and tried to figure out how costly is it. And every time a politician is on TV and promises new ways of perfecting the world, there's always at least one economist who has provided a calculation that shows that this particular policy is awesome. But based on what? Okay, and I would claim that all of these calculations are always wrong because they always underestimate the cost of regulations. Now, here's the thing. With any regulation that has any effect whatsoever, it's going to affect some entrepreneurs. And that means that they will not pursue those ends that they think are of best or highest value to people. So, had it been the case that Henry Ford was not allowed to produce an automobile, say maybe there was climate change in the 1920s or something like that, then maybe he would have invested instead in trying to breed faster horses. Then had we had automobiles today? Probably not. Had we had whatever automobiles led to? Probably not either. And that means, of course, we're not going to get the value that this entrepreneur created. But it's also the case that he would then have not only not created automobiles, but instead invested in breeding faster horses. And that investment uses resources that could be used to some other end. So we have investments then in production capabilities towards ends that are of much lower value to people in general. And of course, those ends too are restricted by policy. So we have, in a sense, replaced consumer sovereignty, where consumers decide what value entrepreneurs' actions are, with the policymakers' judgment and policymaker sovereignty, if you will. They decide what entrepreneurs can do, and entrepreneurs, therefore, do not invest for consumers, but instead invest in what is usually called the social good. Okay, so the real cost, then, of any regulation is all of those values that entrepreneurs do not and cannot and are not allowed to create. And if you think about it, if one entrepreneur is restricted in one way, therefore investing in a lower value for consumers or lower potential value, the economy is path dependent. The economy is cumulative, so other entrepreneurs, the next generation, is going to build off of those ideas. So we're already, if one entrepreneur is restricted, we're on a lower trajectory. Then imagine a world in which all entrepreneurs are restricted and invest in lower trajectory productions. Then we're going to have, instead of a development like this, we're going to have a development like this. And this is still what created all the prosperity in the West today. So where could we have been? Well, we could have been in the world of the Jetsons or something like that. It could have been a fantastic world, but we're simply not there. This real cost is always underestimated because when you calculate the cost of regulation, well, you only do what you know. You can only calculate what you already understand. But as we saw just a few minutes ago, entrepreneurs invest in what no one really does understand. So we only calculate the cost that economists looking at the history in the past understand of what the future could provide, which of course is nowhere near the future that is possible. And I write about this in my previous book, The Seen, the Unseen, and the Unrealized. And the unrealized is exactly this, what we lose out on, and increasingly, because entrepreneurs keep being restricted in their imaginations and in their undertakings. Okay, so how do we then kickstart an economy? What can we do as a free city, or if a new country, or if Elon Musk goes to Mars, or what have you? How can you create a new and better world, if you will? Well, the first thing is to use those three components that I mentioned in the beginning: entrepreneurship, production, and exchange. And they typically happen in that order, and their effectiveness is in that order as well. So entrepreneurship is the most effective, but also the most uncertain and the most difficult and the least plannable. Production is possible, but it relies on entrepreneurship. Production can cut costs, but not really create new value in the sense that entrepreneurs do. And exchanges, they happen whether or not there are regulations, but they're exchanges of things that are already in existence. So preferably, we would want as much entrepreneurship as possible, and then production and trade will follow. The problem is that the difficulty is in this order too. So the difficulty of attracting entrepreneurs is much harder than attracting producers, which is harder than attracting just trade. So if you create a new haven for free market, say, you have to attract people there. And attracting people to just trade with each other is fairly easy compared with attracting people to start manufacturing versus attracting people to take risks and imagine new things and how to do the new things. Of course, you should also engage in institutional competition, because setting an example and setting a new standard forces other states to do the same thing. And we've seen this, we talked in the panel yesterday about Uber, how Uber forced change to taxi companies and so forth. The same thing happens between countries, which is why countries have treaties and try to avoid this competition. So my time is up. Very briefly, I think you saw outside my latest book. I call it My Little Red Book. It is available for free outside. I'm available to chat as well if you want to talk about this and any similar issues. And I'm available online as well. Thank you so much.